5 minutes later. 2 very boring minutes later. 7 o'clock a.m. when neighbors waking up and taking a shower. So much later that the old narrator got tired of waiting and they had to hire a new one. 1 week later. 1 minute later. 8:01 p.m. Many unbearable hours later. 3 hours later. A few dressing later. 1 eternally later. A few inches later. A few seconds later. A few moments later. A few minutes later. 2 hours later. 6.5 hours later. 3 days later. 60 seconds later. 12 o'clock midnight. Several bad puns later. Soon after this. 1 month later. 20 minutes later. Later. Meanwhile. 2,000 years later. Boo boo boo. 3:28 a.m. 100 days later. Inventory. A few counters later. 12 seconds later. 3 weeks later. The next morning. Approximately 10 hours later. Several days later. 6 hours later. Time for sure. The next day. Day 2. Day 3. Day 4. Many months later. 4 months later. More energy later. Several hours later. 1 hour later. 5 years later. 1 year later. 5 weeks later. Tomorrow.